In the early autumn of 1953, the world was suspended in a fragile state of transition. The echoes of the Second World War had finally begun to fade, replaced by the humming electricity of a new atomic age. In the United States, life seemed to follow a predictable, optimistic rhythm: suburban expansion, the rise of television, and the promise of a future powered by the very force that had ended the conflict in the Pacific. But beneath this veneer of progress, a quiet, administrative machinery was beginning to turn. It started with a series of letters, discreetly dispatched from high-level government offices to select medical institutions and hospitals across the country and eventually around the globe. The requests contained in these documents were written in the cold, precise language of clinical research. They did not ask for data or for opinions. They asked for something much more tangible. They asked for human remains. Specifically, they were interested in the bones of the recently deceased, those who had left the world almost as soon as they had entered it. It is estimated that by the end of this effort, officials had coordinated the collection of over 1,500 human bodies, the majority of them infants and young children. For the families mourning in hospital hallways or over small, fresh graves, there was no explanation offered. No forms were signed for the specific use of these remains, and no mention was made of the destination for these samples. At the time, it was simply accepted as part of the silent, somber process of the medical establishment. But that wasn't the strangest part. To understand why this was happening, we have to look toward the horizon, not of the cities, but of the Pacific proving grounds and the Nevada desert. By 1953, the United States and the Soviet Union were no longer just testing weapons, they were reshaping the atmosphere of the planet. Each mushroom cloud that rose into the stratosphere carried with it a cocktail of radioactive isotopes. For years, the official stance was one of reassurance. The fallout, the public was told, would dissipate. It would be diluted by the vastness of the sky and the depths of the ocean. However, behind closed doors, a different narrative was forming. Scientists were beginning to realize that the debris from these explosions didn't just vanish. It fell back to Earth in a fine, invisible dust, entering the soil, the grass, and eventually, the food chain. The concern centered on a specific isotope, strontium-90. In the periodic table, strontium sits directly below calcium. To the human body, the two are almost indistinguishable. When a person consumes milk or vegetables contaminated with fallout, the body doesn't discard the strontium. It treats it like calcium, sending it straight to the bones and teeth to build the framework of the human frame. For an adult, whose bones are already formed, the uptake is slow. But for a growing child, the skeleton is a sponge. This realization created a terrifying blind spot for the Atomic Energy Commission. They knew the world was being dusted with radioactive material, but they had no idea how much of it was actually ending up inside the next generation of human beings. And that's when things began to shift from theoretical physics to a desperate, clandestine search for physical evidence. In the archives of the Rand Corporation and the Atomic Energy Commission, the initiative was given a deceptively bright name: Project Sunshine. The goal was simple: to determine the maximum permissible concentration of radioactive fallout in the human population. But to get an accurate reading, they couldn't rely on soil samples or air filters. They needed human tissue. They needed the very bones that had been constructed out of the environment of the 1950s. The problem was one of logistics and ethics. How does a government agency acquire the remains of hundreds of children without causing a national panic or a moral outcry? The solution they landed on was a network of collectors, doctors, and pathologists who were instructed to bypass the traditional channels of consent. Records suggest that the instructions were clear. The samples were to be obtained as part of routine autopsies. There was no mention of the AEC, no mention of nuclear fallout, and certainly no mention of Project Sunshine. In many cases, the parents were told that a small tissue sample was needed for further testing to determine the cause of death, a common enough occurrence in the medical world. But the reality was that entire limbs, or in some instances, the entire bodies of stillborn infants, were being packaged in dry ice and shipped to secret laboratories at the University of Chicago and other research hubs. These families went home to bury their children, unaware that the physical reality of their loss was being reduced to ash in a laboratory furnace. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. As the first few hundred samples were processed, a pattern began to emerge. The levels of strontium-90, the bones of children, were significantly higher than in adults. It was the first concrete evidence that the atomic age was leaving a permanent, measurable mark on the biology of the human race. But the scientists faced a new problem. To build a statistically significant model, they needed more. They needed a global map of the human skeleton. They began to look beyond the borders of the United States, reaching into the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and even South America. The body snatching, as one participant would later describe it in a moment of candid frustration, was becoming a global operation. The tension within the project was palpable. On one hand, the scientists felt they were performing a vital service for the survival of the species. They believed that without this data, the world would be flying blind into a nuclear future, unaware of the point at which the planet's milk supply would become toxic. On the other hand, the secrecy required to maintain the project was a weight that few could openly acknowledge. They were operating in a moral grey zone, justified by the existential threat of the Cold War. If the public knew that the government was secretly collecting the remains of their children to measure the poison in the air, the political fallout would be as devastating as the radioactive kind. But as 1,953 turned into 1,954, the scale of the testing increased. The United States detonated Castle Bravo, a thermonuclear device far more powerful than anticipated. The radioactive plume spread further than anyone had predicted, contaminating a Japanese fishing boat and several inhabited atolls. The need for Project Sunshine's data became an emergency. The clandestine network of pathologists was pressured to increase their yield. They were no longer just looking for a few samples, they were looking for a steady stream of human material, and yet the families remained in the dark. The silence was maintained by a professional brotherhood of scientists and doctors who believed that the end justified the means. There was, however, a growing disconnect between the clinical reports and the human reality of what was being done. In the laboratory, a child's femur was just a data point, a number on a ledger representing a specific concentration of picocuries per gram of calcium. But in the real world, that femur was a part of a person, a part of a family's grief. The records of the time show a chilling detachment. In one meeting, a prominent scientist lamented the difficulty of finding good samples, noting that they were particularly short on specimens from certain age groups. It was a logistical complaint, voiced with the same tone one might use to discuss a shortage of laboratory glassware. The dehumanization of the samples was a necessary psychological shield for those involved. But the logistics of such a project were daunting, and the methods they would eventually employ would lead to questions that remain unanswered to this day. The logistics of Project Sunshine required more than just passive cooperation. It required a proactive, almost predatory search for specific biological markers. To lead this effort, the Atomic Energy Commission turned to Willard Libby, a brilliant chemist who would later win the Nobel Prize for his work on carbon dating. Libby was a man of immense intellect and singular focus, a scientist who viewed the world through the lens of isotopes and decay rates. In a secret meeting in January 1955, the transcript of which would not see the light of day for decades, Libby laid out the stark reality of their situation. He admitted that the project was desperately short of human samples, particularly from the younger demographic. It was in this closed-door session that he uttered the phrase that would later haunt the legacy of the project. If anybody knows how to do a good job of body snatching, they will really be serving their country. This wasn't a metaphor. Libby was expressing a literal need for a more efficient way to bypass the legal and ethical hurdles of obtaining human remains. Records suggest that he and his colleagues were fully aware of the sensitivity of their work. They knew that if the public caught wind of the fact that the government was actively seeking out the bodies of deceased infants, the backlash would be catastrophic. To mitigate this risk, the project expanded its reach, looking toward regions of the world where the oversight might be less stringent or where the medical establishment was more tightly integrated with government interests. This took the search to the United Kingdom, where a parallel program began to take shape under the guise of general medical research. In British hospitals, particularly in cities like London and Glasgow, a similar pattern began to emerge. Pathologists were instructed to remove the leg bones, the femurs of children who died in the hospital. These samples were then packed and sent to the Atomic Energy Research Establishment at Harwell. Much like in the United States, the parents were left in a state of curated ignorance. They were grieving, focused on the immediate trauma of their loss, and in the social hierarchy of the 1950s, the word of a doctor was rarely questioned. If a physician said that an autopsy was necessary, or that a small sample was needed for the advancement of science, the parents almost always acquiesced. They had no reason to suspect that the advancement of science meant measuring the radioactive byproduct of a hydrogen bomb test in the South Pacific. But the methods used to transport these remains were about to become even more clandestine. The process of analyzing these remains was a grim, industrialized affair. Once a bone arrived at the laboratory, it wasn't simply examined. It was subjected to a process of total reduction. The bone was placed in a high-temperature furnace and burned until nothing remained but a fine grey ash. This ash was then chemically treated to extract the strontium, which was measured for its radioactivity. The results were meticulously recorded in ledgers that read like an inventory of a phantom population. Each entry represented a child, reduced to a concentration of picocuries. Some historians believe that the sheer volume of samples, eventually numbering in the thousands, was intended not just to measure current fallout, but to predict the long-term habitability of the planet in the event of a full-scale nuclear exchange. As the mid-1950s progressed, the scope of the body snatching expanded into the southern hemisphere. Australia, with its vast, sparsely populated interior, had become a testing ground for British nuclear weapons. The Australian government, eager to prove its utility to its allies, facilitated a collection program that was perhaps the most efficient of all. In cities like Adelaide and Melbourne, the collection was streamlined. Researchers were no longer just looking for the bones of the recently deceased. They were looking for a way to track the movement of fallout across the entire continent. They began to collect teeth, specifically the baby teeth of living children, realizing that these, too, served as a permanent record of strontium uptake. This shift in methodology provided a wealth of data, but it also created more opportunities for the secret to leak. And that's when the first cracks in the wall of silence began to appear. There was a growing unease among some of the rank-and-file medical professionals tasked with the collection. While the high-level administrators in Washington and London saw the project as a strategic necessity, the doctors in the morgues were the ones who had to look at the bodies. They were the ones who had to interact with the grieving families. Some records indicate that a few pathologists began to push back, questioning the necessity of such large samples or the lack of formal consent. These objections were largely ignored or suppressed under the umbrella of national security. The project was too important, the data too vital, and the Cold War too precarious to allow for moral hesitation. Yet, despite the pressure, the data they were collecting started to tell a story that was becoming impossible to ignore. The levels of strontium, 90, were rising. Each year, as the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom detonated more powerful devices, the concentration of radioactive isotopes in the bones of children worldwide increased. The maximum permissible concentration that Libby and his team were trying to define was no longer a theoretical limit, it was a looming reality. The scientists were realizing that the very environment that sustained human life was being fundamentally altered. The milk children drank, the vegetables they ate, and the air they breathed were all contributing to a slow, internal accumulation of radiation. The project reached a turning point in the late 1950s when the sheer scale of the operation began to create its own logistical gravity. They were no longer just collecting from hospitals, they were reaching into the archives of medical schools and even historical collections. The demand for fresh samples remained high, but the need for a baseline bones from the pre-atomic era became equally important. This led to the disturbing practice of comparing the bones of children who died in the 1950s with those who had died decades earlier. The contrast was stark. The pre-atomic bones were clean, while the new samples were hot. It was a definitive, scientific proof that the human race had entered a new, and perhaps irreversible, biological epoch. But as the data grew more alarming, the secrecy around Project Sunshine became even more intense. The AEC was terrified that if the public understood the direct link between their nuclear tests and the radioactivity in their children's bones, the testing program would be shut down by a wave of popular protest. To prevent this, the government engaged in a sophisticated campaign of public relations, emphasizing the safety of the tests and the negligible nature of the fallout. They spoke of background radiation and compared the risks to that of a chest X-ray. Meanwhile, the clandestine shipments of dry ice and bone ash continued to arrive at the labs in Chicago and Harwell. What they didn't realize was that the very families they were bypassing were starting to ask their own questions. In small towns near the testing sites and in the suburbs of major cities, people were noticing things. They were noticing the strange, metallic taste in the air after a distant test. They were noticing the way the dust settled on their cars. And in the hospitals, a few parents began to wonder why they weren't allowed to see their children's bodies before they were prepared for burial, or why the casket seemed lighter than it should have been. These were fleeting moments of suspicion, easily dismissed by the authoritative calm of the 1950s medical establishment. But the weight of these secrets was beginning to strain the foundations of the project. The shadow of Project Sunshine was growing too long to remain hidden in the glare of the atomic sun. What happened next would force the project into the light, but not in the way anyone expected. By the end of the 1950s, the atmosphere of the planet was carrying a heavier burden of man-made elements than at any point in history. The secret data gathered by Project Sunshine confirmed what the AEC had feared. The biological accumulation of strontium-90 was not a localized phenomenon, it was a global one. Yet, while the bone collection continued in the shadows, a parallel and much more public effort was beginning to take shape in St. Louis, Missouri. Known as the Baby Tooth Survey, this project led by scientists and concerned citizens asked parents to voluntarily mail in their children's lost milk teeth for testing. It was a grassroots movement, born of the same anxieties that drove Project Sunshine, but operating with a radical transparency. For the officials in Washington, this public interest was a double-edged sword. It provided even more data, but it also threatened to pull the curtain back on the more clinical, non-consensual methods they had been using for years. But the silence couldn't last forever. As the 1960s dawned, the geopolitical landscape began to shift. The Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963 moved nuclear testing underground, effectively ending the massive injection of radioactive fallout into the atmosphere. With the primary source of strontium-90 curtailed, the urgency of Project Sunshine began to wane. The secret shipments of bone ash and the clandestine requests to hospitals slowly tapered off. The project didn't end with a press conference or a public report. It simply faded into the administrative background, its records filed away in restricted archives. For decades, the families who had unknowingly contributed to this global ledger of the atomic age lived their lives, unaware that their children's remains had played a role in the most significant environmental study of the century. The story might have remained buried, if not for a series of investigative inquiries in the mid-1990s. Spurred by the declassification of thousands of Cold War documents, journalists and researchers began to piece together the true scale of the AEC's activities. In 1995, then, Secretary of Energy Hazel O'Leary made a public apology for the ethical lapses of the Cold War era, acknowledging that the government had conducted thousands of radiation experiments on its own citizens. Hidden within this mountain of data were the transcripts and letters of Project Sunshine. It was only then that the specific phrase body snatching reached the public ear. What was once a state secret was about to become a public reckoning. In the United Kingdom, the revelation was particularly jarring. A 1955 report finally made public detailed how the femurs of over 3,000 children had been taken for testing between 1954 and 1970. One case in particular, that of a mother named Jean Guy, became a focal point for the narrative. Her daughter, Anne, had died in 1957 at just a few days old. For nearly 40 years, Jean had lived with the quiet grief of her loss, only to discover through a newspaper report that her daughter's legs had been removed by a pathologist and sent to a nuclear research facility. There was no record of consent, and no explanation ever offered. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was a systemic policy that had been replicated across continents. When investigators began to look closer at the records, there was one final detail that didn't add up. The numbers in the official reports and the numbers in the lab ledgers didn't always match. While the AEC admitted to collecting approximately 1,500 samples, some researchers believe the true number when including the international collections could be significantly higher, perhaps exceeding 6,000 specimens. The discrepancy suggests that the network of collectors was even more vast and decentralized than previously thought. Much of the documentation remains missing or was destroyed as part of routine record-keeping in the 1970s, leaving a permanent gap in the historical record. Today, the legacy of Project Sunshine is viewed through two very different lenses. From a strictly scientific perspective, the data collected was invaluable. It allowed researchers to understand how radioactive isotopes move through the human body, a knowledge base that is still used today to set safety standards for everything from nuclear power plants to medical imaging. Some historians argue that without this data, the world would have been far slower to recognize the dangers of atmospheric testing, potentially leading to even greater environmental damage. They see it as a necessary, if tragic, byproduct of a world on the brink of nuclear catastrophe. However, from an ethical and human perspective, the project remains a profound betrayal of the social contract. It represents a moment in history where the clinical needs of the state were placed squarely above the fundamental rights of the individual. The fact that the most vulnerable members of society, infants and their grieving families, were the primary subjects of this secret surveillance adds a layer of moral complexity that cannot be easily resolved by scientific Utility. The samples were not just biological material, they were the lost futures of thousands of families, treated as commodities in a high-stakes game of nuclear chess. As we look back at the documents and the grainy photographs of the 1950s, the image that remains is one of a world in transition. We see the mushroom clouds and the suburban homes, the brilliant scientists and the grieving mothers. We see a generation that was, in a very literal sense, built out of the fallout of the atomic age. The strontium, 90, that was measured in those labs, hasn't entirely disappeared. It has a half-life of 29 years, meaning that a fraction of the isotopes released in the 1950s still exists today, decaying slowly in the soil and, perhaps, in the bones of those who lived through that era. Modern re-examinations of the project often end with more questions than answers. Were there other isotopes being tracked? How many more families were affected but never notified? While the government has apologized, the full extent of the collectors' network remains a subject of debate among historians. There is no clear consensus on where the line should have been drawn, or if such a line was even possible during the height of the Cold War. What remains is an archive of numbers and names, a testament to a time when the world was so focused on the horizon that it forgot to look at what was happening in its own hospitals. The story of the 1,500 bodies and the thousands more that followed serves as a somber reminder of the hidden costs of progress. It is a narrative of a time when the boundaries between science, security, and ethics were blurred by the shadow of the bomb. The families were never informed of the reason, and for many, the explanation arrived too late to offer any real comfort. The bones of those children are gone, reduced to ash and data points in a forgotten ledger, but the questions they leave behind continue to resonate. They remind us that history is not just a collection of events, but a series of choices, some made in the light, and others made in the quiet, clinical darkness of a laboratory. The atomic age gave us the power to reshape the world, but it also took something away, a sense of certainty that the bodies of our loved ones belong to us, and not to the state. The ledger is closed, the fallout has settled, but the silence of 1953 still speaks.